All right, I guess we're going to start. It is 1 o'clock, but I feel like there are people who are going to be wandering in late because if they're anything like me, they got lost several times trying to figure out where the meeting was. Let's see, can you guys all hear me in the back? I project pretty well. I don't want to sit down with the microphone. My name's Dan Mayer. I'm a retired professor of emergency medicine. I retired from Albany Medical College 10 years ago, and this is what a retired professor of emergency medicine looks like. I am a decision editor at Western Journal of Emergency Medicine and at JSEP Open, and I've been doing peer review for probably about 30 years now. We have a very distinguished panel that's going to try and help you all get a sense of how you can do a good peer review. And hey, Cole, join us, please. We'd love to have more people. Well, go out and bring a few friends if you like. But anyway, sorry, that's what happens if I know you. Put you on the spot. So anyway, we're going to talk about, give you a sense of how to be good at being a peer reviewer. And having been a decision editor, I certainly see that there are not everybody who's a peer reviewer is good. Although having been doing peer reviews for 30 years, I got to tell you that people are getting better at it. That when I first started doing this, many of the reviews that I read were very short and didn't really give any information. And I don't see too many of those anymore. I'll ask my colleagues in the group if they agree with that. I suspect they will. So what we want to do is we want to sit you at, have 2 or 3 of each of the people who are the subjects of the meeting that we're trying to teach you about, sit at each table, and then we're going to fill in. So who here is signed up to take this as a, so we got most of you are concentrated at that table. You guys want to split up a little bit? And I probably am doing this out of order, aren't I? But 2 people over there, and then we'll get some of our people, Bob and Mike.
So we'd like to have 2 or 3 students at each table.
Two or 3 students and 2.
We don't have to, but it's
of
nice.
of the facilitators at each meeting. So just shuffle a little bit right now, and so you'll let me mess it up, right? All right, so before we get really going, I'm going to introduce us. This is our disclosure list. And I'm going to let each of our facilitators introduce themselves. I'm Dan Mayer. You already got me. Lynn, you're next on the list.
I'm Lynn Rapolo. I'm a retired professor from UT Southwestern. And I'm still young enough, I thought, to still work. I'm actually in my faculty job here at Fort Worth. I'm a senior editor for behavioral.
Mark?
Mark Langdorf. I'm from the University of California, Irvine, and I'm the editor-in-chief of Western Journal of Emergency Medicine, an associate editor of CPC-EM, Clinical Practice and Cases in Emergency Medicine, which is the affiliated case report journal.
All right, next is Rich.
I'm a full professor of emergency medicine at Kings County and SUNY Downstate in Brooklyn. And we're here to train people to help us. I'm a decision editor for academic emergency medicine. So we need reviewers. So one of the impetuses for us to train people and increase the pool of reviewers.
All right, Michael.
Hey, like I can project very well that microphone. And So excited to have this. I approached it from the lens that pretty much we're always going to learn our peer reviews. I've done, I don't know, maybe thousands of peer reviews at this point, probably a lot. And I still learn from each round when I see what other people have done. So I think it kind of approaches the lifelong learner mindset. Outside of that, professor of EM, vice chair of research and production in Chicago. I edit for Annals of EM, AMENT, Academic Medicine, AGM, and recently stepped down from WestGem, and then I'm also social media AMENT, and then SAEM.
It'd be easier if you just told us what journals you were not an editor for. Addie?
Man, I don't like everyone after Mike. I'm Addie Malik. I'm an associate professor of emergency medicine at KU Med Center in Kansas City. I'm here because I peer review for a whole bunch of different journals, and I like to tell other people how to do it and tell them you definitely don't have to be an expert in statistics or an expert in evaluation before me do this and be very good at it.
Great. Josh?
Hi, yes, my name is Josh Davis. I'm an ER physician. I actually practice at a community site in Wichita, Kansas. I'm affiliated with KU from Kansas City with Addie, but we have a branch campus out there. So I kind of am representing the kind of community view here. I do teach, I do run a course at a local med school, and I do lots and lots of peer reviews. I have not been doing anything for 30 years, unlike Dan says he's been doing peer reviews for 30 years. Not nearly as accomplished as Mike, but hopefully it can offer some important insights.
Well, you also don't have OLD. So, Martin is unable to make it today, and so we have, next is Brian.
I'm Brian Kane. I'm a professor of emergency medicine, currently at University of South Florida, about to be Jefferson. It's a merger story that I can go over later. I've been an APD and our program at the Lehigh Valley Health Network. We train 16 residents a year for almost 20 years. And in that role as APD, my job is journal club and scholarship and publication and why. And the last thing I did last night before going to bed was submit a peer review. And we had 2 of our residents participating there. So every one of you can be a peer reviewer. It's just going to make you better in so many ways. It's my top now.
And Rob?
I'm Rob Irvin. I'm from Wayne State. I'm a stats editor for AEM, some other journals and stuff like that. I think it's, again, I think what Mike said, and actually Rochelle said the same thing too. Like, I've been doing this for about 12 years. I think it's a great opportunity to give back to the specialty, but also like learn something. Like, I still read the reviews that get sent out by other people so I can see what I missed and other people's take on stuff. So it's a journey, and I felt like someone who had brain damage the first time I tried to do a peer review. It's like embarrassing to think about things that I said and the comments I made 12 years ago, but it's like a constant process. So, well.
And Rochelle?
I'm a professor of medicine at UCLA. I have been a med stats editor at Annals of Emergency Medicine for 27 years. I've been a guest editor there. I do reviews. I submitted a review about an hour and a half ago. Showing down here, and I still learn. My papers better. I help people along, and it is always a learning process for your own work. And also learn how to actually convey that. Science is messy. Nothing's perfect. And our goal is to get everyone's work out there in a way that's successful. And really appreciate all of you coming here and spending your time. While we have the structure of the program, we have some time at the end. You want to ask an editor, editors, how do I do this better? Do it right.
Great. So we've got everybody, all the facilitators introduced. Now we want to find out who you guys are. Let's start, Brian, with your table. And please project. We have a really rowdy group back here.
So
Behind this wall.
give your name, give where you're from, and if you have a goal of the session today, so we as a faculty can meet that. And start with this nice gentleman here.
I'm Tim Batchelor. I'm a dual fellow at Stanford University. I graduated residency in 2022. I've been doing a fair amount of like low order level publishing since I started fellowship, and I just like to go a little bit better about doing it.
At least level measure education at the University of Chicago.
Right.
Peer review, I always find something and miss something, and I really like to get more structure. They not miss much.
Okay.
I'm the same for Germany with usually the US. First of all, from Europe for us. And I'm here with the same reason we're doing is say Western from Bakersfield, California, we are, learning.
Just the fact that didn't play, I want to do my own writing, my own submission, and generally I work with my team to help them identify some pieces for peer review for the peer reviewers, right?
Right. Next.
I'm Michael from India, Senior Assistant Department of Statistics. I want to see how this peer work works actually. I'm not.
Hi, everyone. I'm Keith Ongadden. I'm one of the APDs at Detroit Receiving and EMS trained. I review probably very badly for AEMET and then pre-hospital emergency care. So looking to get better as well.
Greg Ostrowski. I'm an emergency physician and neurointensivist. I occasionally get asked to do peer reviews of some articles, and I do a very mixed job at it. And I want to learn how to do this better, but also more efficiently without getting bogged down into like editing details and what's a detail that's too small to review and so on. Hi, my name's Ian Olive. I'm on the editorial team of the Western Journal of Emergency Medicine. I just graduated from UC Irvine for my undergrad last year, so I'm probably the farthest in this room from completing a real peer review, but I'm here to learn what I can.
Hi, I'm Jana Anderson. I'm pediatric emergency medicine from Mayo Clinic, Rochester. And my goal is just to become a better peer reviewer, to just improve my publications too.
Hi, everyone. My name's Amina. I'm coming from Vanderbilt University. I'm a research analyst in the emergency medicine department. I've been helping a lot of faculty right now on their research proposals. So I would say I'm really hoping to get out of this being able to look at what key components I could focus on myself so I could help faculty better with their projects and moving more forward effectively.
Hi, I'm Dominic Gregorio. I'm a third-year med student from Pennsylvania and here to volunteer. So if you see a blue jacket and need anything, please ask us. Or if you have any advice, you can give it to us. So similarly, like I'm here to learn just as much about how I should be writing my papers and like be well received by a peer reviewer as to eventually be a peer, like you said, Ian. So thanks for having us.
My name is Anthony Weeks. I'm a professor of emergency medicine, Carolinas Medical Center. I've been a peer reviewer. I've also received peer reviews. It's good to see the names of some of the people that send the messages of love to me. I've learned how to just absorb it, take the hit, walk away for a day, come back and realize, you know what? That was bloody unclear what I sent. And then you come back, and a lot of times the peer reviewer comments are spot on. You improve it, and it still continues. It's still learning every day. So I'm glad to be here.
Good. And just to amplify on that, it's all done with love. You know.
Hi, I'm Mike Lozano, EM and EMS at the University of South Florida. Been kind of slogging along on reviews, and I think I needed a catalyst to kind of get better at this.
That's a good reason. Hey everyone, I'm Jacob Stabell. I'm a critical care paramedic, mostly at Sinai in New York City on the NEO-PEDS team. I learn every single time I get a peer review back, and I think that I really need to get on the other side of it and learn more about the peer review process.
Hi, I'm Rhythm. I'm finishing up a medical education fellowship. I traveled really far and wide from Jefferson, a few blocks away. So I'm fairly new at peer review and just want to get a better framework on how to approach it.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Ed Michelson, Professor and Chair, Department of Emergency Medicine, Texas Tech in El Paso, also Associate Editor of
So you're taking this and facilitating. We can rope you in. All right. Well, good. Nice to have all of you here and welcome you. So I've got somewhere else we have educational objectives. If I can figure out how to make a computer work. I told you I had OLD, right? So we want you to be able to list the benefits of being and having peer reviewers. We're going to describe a structured, more or less structured process for doing peer reviews in general, and we'll apply that to a paper that we've given you. You all should have a copy. And then we're going to have a discussion about each of the parts of the paper and what they mean and how to do a peer review of them. And then we'll end up with just a free-floating discussion about some of the issues involved in peer review and how we can help you be better peer reviewers in the future. So let me start off with Brian. I think you're up.
And for the faculty, the table here in the back, I think, does need a...
I got them. Yeah. So wir haben zwei deutschen Sprecher. Ich bin einer und Brian ist der andere. So wir können arbeiten mit du. Sorry, my German is not so good, but not this time. But invite me to Germany and I'll bone up on it.
All right, so we're gonna dive in. I'm gonna sell, but you probably don't need to be sold wine to do peer review. I'm also gonna encourage everybody to give Dominic a round of applause. He just won an award as a med student at the state meeting a couple weeks ago.
Hey.
Academic EM is awesome, Dominic. We're so psyched you're here today. So why do peer review? At the end of the day, I think all of you expressed there's a quid pro quo. My papers get better because a peer review was said in the back. I know mine do as well. And if we're gonna have journals, the journal editors need us to help be peer reviewers. I think we all accept that, but let me give you a couple other reasons. The ACGME every year in July, I'm an APD, so that has to wear and is very deep in regulations how to not have our program get cited. And what every program does, if you didn't know this, is upload information about their faculty and their residents as to what academic activity they did in the last 12 months. One of those categories is peer review. Dan has led efforts to have that move from being a bundled, dichotomized reporting option to one which is separate and quantified so that peer review can be measured, because again, we can't have journals without peer reviewers. So we need to make sure we recognize this. So the rest of this, my hope is relatively self-apparent. I'm not going to read the slides that are up there, but peer review is a way to make connections. It's going to help you with promotion. I know there are some people in the audience that recently just got promoted, and that's awesome. And because of the connections they're making through things like this. Why do I peer review often? It makes me better at my day job. You can't share the substance of the paper you peer review, but it's going to be impossible to forget it. The peer review that I turned in last night, I learned about. I'm still thinking about. It was an educational paper. How can I be a better teacher? And I learned about the concept because I raised my hand and said, yes, I'll peer review that paper. So I'm going to, for the interest of time, not go over all these bullets, but suffices to say, from a regulatory perspective, from a personal growth perspective, from a career perspective, there are measurable benefits to being a peer reviewer. Thanks, Dan.
All right. Eddie?
Right. I think I'm loud enough that everybody can hear me, but if I need to speak out, somebody just wave at me from the back. So what is the point of doing So your job is to consider everything that has been presented to you in this paper and determine whether or not it is reasonably true. And then also to determine whether or not there are things within that paper that need improvement to make it the better version of itself. When I first started peer reviewing, I was hyper concerned that my lack of knowledge or things that I wasn't good at would prevent me from being able to determine whether or not papers were acceptable, whether or not things were done correctly within them. But that is a misconception of the role. All of these papers that you are getting will eventually be published in a journal, and the goal is to get this information disseminated to as many people as possible. So your job as a peer reviewer is to take a look at what has been presented to you and determine if it is palatable and presentable for the audience at large. So even if you aren't totally familiar with the material, is it readable for you? Can you see any major flaws? Is there anything that you thought about after reading this paper that you think inclusion or removal of would make a much better paper? You are basically trying to help the authors understand the things that they need to do to improve a little bit to make this a great paper, the things they need to improve a lot to make this a reasonably acceptable paper, and then every once in a while, determining that what you've been presented with does not seem to fit with the results or the methods that were included, and that's when you say, maybe this paper is not fully sure. But again, every single one of you, your job is to review the paper at your skill level and report back to the editor what you think about it. All of us can do that.
Editors kind of took an initial kind of screen of like the great deal, meaning that like, you know, I look at a paper that was presented to me and like, it's not, you know, anything new in my wheelhouse. Like I like reviewing pigment fractures, but this is a different country and everyone's reviewing, it's still interesting, but I don't. But they sent it to me.
In order to not burden our reviewers with papers that aren't going to get accepted or published, every journal, to my knowledge, has somebody look it over and decide whether it fits the niche of the journal. So if you get it, the editor is considering it.
I think a lot of things, publication science is a little, or an international journal. It's another country that doesn't make it bad.
Rochelle, we can't quite hear you. There was a microphone floating around.
And how we think the U.S. is not how everyone else does emergent medicine. There's a really important thing about that. Some people practice in austere environments, and you were tagged as an expert. You've published in this, and so the editor wants to know, how does this fit into the context? This does an important job replicating what we know. In this group, it's sort of what's different, and so you can provide one. They follow standards, but also really people are looking for like, you're the content expert in this. How does it add?
How do you distinguish between, the nuances between a major concern or subject, something that you will bring up for discussion versus labeling it as a flaw? Since the decision that go with the flag, you're labeling it under that subsection of major cause.
I'm sorry, but we had a lot of background noise here, so let's
distinguish,
if we can use the microphone more liberally.
How do you distinguish a concern, for example, with an outcome that was chosen, with or without the rationale for picking that outcome, versus labeling it a flaw as a peer reviewer?
So this is kind of up to you and why you've been invited, right? So something that I may see as a reviewer as a major flaw, one of the other reviewers or the editor may only see as minor. You have been asked to review this because your opinion is wanted, and we're not always going to agree on what level of flaw something is. Although, you know, if the results don't match the methods that were used, like blatantly, everybody should agree that that's a major flaw. Or if the conclusion drawn has nothing to do with the pre-specified outcomes for the paper, we can all agree that's a pretty major flaw that will require some revision. But the rest of it, it truly is like your expert opinion is what's being asked. And that's not always going to be the same as everybody else's. So just report back how you feel about what you read.
also, that's why we have multiple reviewers review each paper. So they're going to be divergent opinions all the time, and we expect a decision in this. And you have to make an argument in the paper that a major flaw cannot be fixed. The data either was so biased when it was entered, or so poorly organized that no matter what I send back, it's not going to be published. And that's up to you guys. And then we'll make a final decision based on a number of reviewers.
I was just thinking, it also depends on folks. I think using the Equator Network to actually before rather than. Oh, yeah,
That's
super
a
helpful.
really good segue into our next slide. And
It's a moon slide.
we're going to let Rich talk about that.
So one of the problems when I started as a reviewer many years ago, and I see other reviewers, is they don't know how to structure. What's the questions I have to ask the paper? Some of those are your expertise in the subject. Did they miss a paper that should be in? Did they miss a landmark paper? Did they quote a paper wrong? Is the methodology so biased we can never figure out what's going on? But to give you some structure of how to do a research, what are we looking for in the abstract, the methods, the results, the discussion, the conclusion, references? This group of exhaustive search, I think, this exhaustive search I did of looking at checklists. So the checklists are determined by the type of paper that you're reviewing. An RCT has a different checklist than a cohort, the prospective cohort study, different than an educational paper, different than an animal paper. So depending upon the type of article, these references give you checklists to at least structure and get the review started. It doesn't provide any expert. There's no expert, right? That's what you provide. But the structure of the review should follow these things. And these slides are going to be available to you. You can copy, you don't have to copy these down. We're going to hand these out to you. And I found this for my reviewers in my training in my place. I always give them one of these checklists and say, just go through the paper, go through the checklist, see if they fit the major lines. Where did they fall down? So this is hopefully very helpful.
So through the SAEM app, all of the slides are available, including these.
And I just wanted to add, now, how many of you have taken or been taught evidence-based medicine in medical school or in your training? Somewhere along the line. You can just stand up. Raise your hands high. I want to see if there are any gaps. So everybody's had some training in evidence-based medicine. I think this is where I'm allowed to make a plug for my book. Essential Evidence-Based Medicine. The 3rd edition is coming out somewhere in the next year or 2 or 3 or 4. I don't know how long it takes Cambridge to get this done. But anyway, but there are other textbooks too. I have to be clear about it that teach you basically the principles of how do you do critical appraisal through evaluating studies. You know, how good is the research? And having taught evidence-based medicine for over 20 years, what it really comes down to is that we want research that is fair and honest and unbiased and replicable. So that's what we're aiming for, and the only way that that's going to happen is if we have a group of peer reviewers. So on that note, what we're going to do now is we're going to break you up into small groups. So we don't want too many people. Maybe some of you guys at that back table. Come on over here. 2 people. The 2 on my right. Yeah. And I'm going to join you guys in the back table there for the German speaking, so I can speak some German too. And what we're going to do is we're going to go over this paper. It's a real paper. It's not made up. And we're going to go through each section separately. And as we go through the sections, we'll have somebody who will talk about each section for briefly, and then you'll spend 5 minutes, or 5 or 6 minutes reading, or a couple of minutes reading, and then talking about that section, and then we'll reconvene as a group. All right, so who goes next? Lynn.
So just before we get into the abstract, at your table should be a one-sheet handout, which is a sample template that we use at the Western Journal of Emergency Medicine to focus the review and give you structure that you can use as you're going through the review, going through the paper. So this is very much smaller and not as comprehensive as what we just saw in all those resources, but it's one way to organize your thoughts and your review of the paper. So we can use that.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and start. We are going to talk about the abstract, but before I talk about that, I just wanted to fully disclose that what you're about to critique is my paper. Okay, so think about this phase when I'm just kidding. I'm only saying that is because we all get reviews. I've had so many reviews on research. One of them, I was telling them earlier that they asked me to repeat my entire study. And that was a blow because I put so much hard work and to get that kind of feedback. But I did it, and it was a much better study. So as cruel, as harsh as it might seem, the people who are reviewers, and I want you to be thinking of this as a reviewer yourself, is to be constructive and think about how you can help this person get published. And it may not be in your journal, but eventually, if they're persistent enough, they will eventually get published. So anyway, so I'm going to just talk about the abstract section. And the way that this is going to work is we'll talk about a section, and then we'll review it as a group, and then we might kind of have like a collective brief discussion, and then we'll move on to the next section. So as far as the abstract, people have different approaches. Some people don't look at the abstract until they review the entire paper. I like to review the abstract actually before because it's really easy to review, and it kind of gives me a heads up as to what kind of study I'm looking at, and maybe I need to review some content. Maybe I need to pull up the guidelines, the reporting guidelines that we had just mentioned, but just a framework before I actually go into the paper. And then also definitely, and this is very important, is to review the abstract afterward to make sure that it correctly reflects what the research paper is about, that the data is accurate, that the conclusions are accurate and a reflection of what they actually studied. Because many people, when you're doing a review of the literature, you frequently just look at the abstract. And that may be the only thing of that paper that somebody looks at. So that's very important as a reviewer. It should stand alone. Just by looking at it, you can have a general idea of the very basic background information. And usually the initial framework you can get from any journal. They'll have that in the guidelines. But it's pretty generic. They'll have some background, usually one sentence or two sentences. They need objectives or the hypothesis followed by methods. Results are the bulk of the abstract. And then conclusions. And then in conclusions, they might slip in something like future directions. And the abstract is frequently like word prohibitive. And so that's not your job, though. But just keep in mind when people are trying to construct this abstract is they're trying to include as much as they can. So it may not be their fault, but it should be able to stand alone, make sure it's structured properly, and just, again, make sure it reflects the important information that it is supposed to convey, that it is not overstating its conclusions or what it's reporting, or it's not understating. Maybe you might find something in the paper that you feel like is really important to put in that abstract. So this is kind of where you come in, is giving them some feedback as to improving the quality of their paper. Okay, so right now, why don't you go ahead and review this abstract. This is a student study, by the way. A lot of my research has been with medical students. And so we submitted it. We're waiting to hear back from the journal I edit for. So, but anyway, don't hold anything back, by the way. Just give your honest feedback.
And we're going to do about 10 minutes to read it and discuss it, and Eddie is going to be our pickoff here.
Yes. Okay. So give it a read for about 3 minutes, and then we'll chat.
All right, everybody get to the end?
The abstract or the paper?
The abstract.
Oh, I'm reading it up.
Reader. All right, but, okay, so in the abstract, generally based on this abstract, do you feel like you have a good idea of what this paper is going to be about? Do you want to read it? Yeah. Yeah, based on the abstract.
Kind of those ways with ultrasound, it kind of seems like kind of a no duh. If I need to grab, if I'm gonna do a femoral line, I'm gonna grab ultrasound unless it's a crash line.
And you will find that with some papers that get sent to you where you're like, don't we do this already? This is like standard practice. Correct. Yeah, exactly. But so, what are your thoughts? I've got to read that.
I agree. I have an idea what it's going to be about, but it's kind of a why do I want to read this manuscript, right? If it was a different cohort, maybe like a crash and trauma patient, like maybe that would be more utility and like not in all, at least in the United States, right, where we have access to it.
Yeah. Based on this abstract, is there anything that stands out to you immediately as, oh, that's a good idea about how to do this, or maybe that's an issue?
I think I've always wondered, like, this is one of my mentors was talking, like, oh, back in the day we used to do IGs without ultrasound, and he's like, but now I just recommend that you do landmark and then look at the ultrasound, look how far off you would have been. So it's kind of interesting that it's not far off.
So I never thought about bandsomes affecting accuracy. That
Makes sense though, right? Yeah.
So that part's kind of interesting. And going back to the Stone Age, I rely less on estimating distance between landmarks and more on palpating the artery and understanding what the relationship was of the vein to the artery. To me, that was way more important than estimating distance between two veins.
Yeah. I mean, that's something, like sometimes when I read through the abstract, I think about things relative to my practice or how I train. And I'm like, okay, I want to see if they address that later on in the paper. So when I peer review, I keep an open Word document and I just sort of jot down my thoughts as I go through every single section so that I can kind of remember to circle back to it as I'm reading through the paper. But based on this abstract, right, you have a good idea of what the paper's about. Do they note what their output measurements are going to be? Like what they specifically are going to be looking at?
Yeah, they have to be objective. They're looking at their hypothesis for how far it's going to be away.
Yeah, and so this is another thing that for the abstract, I like to take a look at what it's sort of like calling your shot in the pool, right? So they've called their shot, what they're going to be looking at. I want to make sure that what they have called out in the abstract is reflective of the paper, and that kind of continues all the way through. Because the abstract, everything that they say they're going to do here
should be reflected in the main paper. So I kind of like to key in on what did they say they were going to be looking at, and what did they say their outcome was in the abstract, because there is a shocking number of times that those don't actually match up with the manuscript. So it's just like a little side note that I like to make. Is there anything that you guys would want to see done differently or improved upon in this abstract to make you like it more?
I wonder if they should mention something about BMI increasing, because when it pops up in the results section, Frank, I was a little surprised about it. You mentioned the Hansen, but the BMI, that kind of took me by surprise. I didn't see that coming. I wish that could have been mentioned in the background, even if it's our hypothesis.
And also kind of in the back of our minds, maintaining the recognition that there's usually a word count on abstracts, somewhere between 200 and 300 words. So sometimes there are things that are missing here that maybe would have helped a little bit, but might not be there because of word count. But big things, once you read the paper, that you're like, that should have been in the abstract, that would be something to pay attention to.
I also think that it's overly detailed in terms of describing the results.
I totally agree.
I think the abstract, you summarize the high level view of your results.
Yeah.
And then this level of detail would go into that section of the paper. So I would change that.
Yeah. And the methodology really left me wanting a little bit, because they describe things in the results, so there's no mention of the methodology, even like a sentence to say, like, we performed these subgroup analyses.
Totally agree. I feel like there could have been just a little bit more there so that I understand how they got to this conclusion. Because depending on how they did this, it's either going to make me want to read this more, or make me go, nah, this isn't something I want to do. Oh, excellent. Anybody else? I'm the draconian type.
Yeah, we're supposed to stop at the abstract, right? Then we'll go through the picture.
Okay, got it.
Okay.
One sentence.
It needs me just like a touch more, just a touch more.
Specificity in terms of what it's going to be.
Yeah. So if you had to give a one-liner about these abstracts, which one would it be?
I would say this is a project looking to compare ultrasound for just a topic location to identify veins. I don't think it's a very good abstract. It's okay abstract.
Revisions required. Revisions required. I wouldn't reject a name, but I would say revisions required.
All right, where's everybody at on their discussions? Everybody finished up? Well, we're at 10 minutes, so. Okay, so one at your table.
I think normally we're supposed to be kind of see it's just the two of us.
What all the tables kind of thought about their abstract. So Brian, you wanna corral your table and talk about what you guys decided about this abstract?
Sure.
Identify the location of blah, blah, blah.
So I've been asked to overspeak everybody. I apologize for doing so to keep us on time. Our table had a really great discussion about this standalone abstract. Some of the things that we noted were how to use the abstract to decide if you're going to accept or reject the invitation from the journal. The comment was made earlier, do I have expertise? If this was to land in your inbox, I'm not great at ultrasound, 2 of my residents are here, they would say, no, Kane, you shouldn't, no, please don't, as an example. We had questions about decisions, things like, what is 1 centimeter? Where does it come from? And our decision was that'll help guide our reading further in the paper. We noticed at some high levels some typos in grammar, but we decided we would just give that as a comment and not try to drill down. We had a little concern about the conclusion and how well it matched what was in the results. And in the results, it looks like there were some secondary areas of measure that weren't disclosed up in the objective session. There was a lot else that we went over, but to try to keep it succinct, I think there's just some high-level things that our group noticed. And Addie, am I giving this to another group, or we're just going to keep this short because of time, and we're going to dive into the next section of the paper?
We got 3 whole minutes. Why don't you pass it to Dan's group?
Oh, they're just camera shy. That's all. So we felt that we were kind of wondering, this apparently was trying to show that the gold standard was the ultrasound, that was the actual location of the femoral vein, and yet that didn't really come across in the abstract. And how close were they? The fact that on average they were more than a centimeter away, does that really tell us how good it is as a standalone test? I think that pretty much covers it.
For our group, as far as like big picture, I think one thing that we thought, and Brian kind of mentioned this, it seems like there's a lot of extraneous information in the results section, and this could have been thinking of it as like the elevator pitch of the kind of article. It had a lot of good information there, but I think if they had taken some of that out and relegated that to the paper, they could have made a better like pitch of why this is important. And because what Dr. Gottlieb was saying was like, well, their conclusion is POCUS should preferentially be used for femoral vein, central vein, and like I already believe that. And so what is in this paper that is actually important? You could probably do a little bit more in the background and to set that up a little bit better.
All right, want to move on to the next?
One more comment. The paper didn't study whether or not POCUS should be used for the femoral vein access. They don't have any what happened to the patient, so they need to qualify their conclusion with POCUS should be used to identify the location of the femoral vein. That would be appropriate, but not to be used for femoral vein access. That's way too broad.
And we had one other comment, which was that that the method section seemed a little short. And I think this goes along with what Josh just said about the results being a little too long. And that did we need to know the BMI and the hand length, or would we rather have known who was doing the ultrasound and who was doing the landmark process?
I think that it probably would have been enough in the methods to simply say that you are, evaluating user variability between users, right? That was something that would be considered for secondary analysis. And just, yeah, I think from the methods, I would really want to know at least a little bit more about who are you approaching. In this case, the convenience sample is, I think in a manuscript like this, you really do want to have a sample size because you do really want to have the numbers required to show significance between those two measurements.
All right, so we are going to move on to the intro.
Well,
I had that on.
Just quickly, what amplify what just said is convenience sample is who you're studying. Are you studying in this study? Are we studying the patients, or are we studying the people who are doing the measurement?
It's also part of the results.
Well, don't worry, guys. You're going to have far more opportunities to get into this paper and decide which of these things that they tackled and didn't. So the next part that we need to discuss is one of my favorite parts in papers, which is the intro, which I like to think of as like the true sales pitch of your paper, right? Why should I care about this study that you're doing? Why does it matter? And why is it important that you undertook this? So you want to take a look at the intro and you want to see how well did they sort of set up the shot that is their paper. Did they provide appropriate background that is recent and relevant for why they're going to be undertaking this? You also want to make sure that in this section, somewhere they very plainly state their objectives and their outcomes that they're going to be looking at. It is not infrequent that people submit a great paper that they just don't do a particularly good job about outlining what the specific things are that they are going to be looking for in this paper. You read the whole thing and then you're like, did they actually achieve the outcomes that they set out to achieve? Did they actually measure what they were looking to measure, or did they kind of meander off and look at some other stuff? So this is the area where both for peer review and for writing your own papers, you want to make sure that plain as day, you lay out, or the authors have laid out exactly what their goal is of this paper and what it is that they are going to be looking at. And more importantly, does the intro make you want to read the rest of the paper? Like, does this pique your interest? Even if it doesn't pique your interest, do you think that it would pique the interest of other readers for this particular journal? Right? This is a section that can really make a paper relevant to a journal or not. So you want to key in, clue in, make sure it looks like they are tackling those things. Did you have a question, or were you stretching? Okay.
You might, because this was on the abstract one as well. When it comes to doing a review for a journal, and it comes to like the formatting, is that something that's usually like that is taken care of before it comes to you? Or should I be making sure, like, with the abstract, is it formatted correctly? Well, I mean, that depends on the journal's requirements. So I guess which way is that usually?
Specific, like detaily grammar formatting things are usually taken care of by the journal. They more just want your opinion about the content. So I wouldn't get too bogged down by a lot of those things unless it's like the grammar's blatantly awful and you can't follow what's going on in that section. Otherwise, the journal will take care of that on their end. Like if they've got word counts for sections, don't trouble yourself with that. Somebody else is going to take care of that. Same thing with abstracts. There's usually word counts for abstracts. And if it's made it to you, it must have cleared the manuscript building process that usually gives you a hard no if you go over on the word count. Does that answer your question?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Perfect. Rochelle, did you want to?
Requirements. And just think about yourself as an author and you submit to one journal, they don't want it. I don't expect, if you gave it to me in JAMA style because you aimed high and JAMA didn't take it, I can review it. If I want it, then I'm going to tell you to put it in my format for my journal. So one, as an author, I wouldn't get too bogged down in it, although some journals are very tight about it. And just as a reviewer, don't so much worry about that as long as the content is there that you can review.
All right, we're going to do another 10 minutes and then discuss our thoughts from the various tables on the intro and background. And Dan, this is a hard 10 minutes. I'm cutting you off if you start talking again. I usually try to do, I know, 'cause I have the same, like, to do that. Yeah, I try to do just one, every so often. Online a couple times. Yes, I think, you know, including something about it, but that's why it's fair about identifying where this is, probably a generic thing. Far more than needed, and then they add this description of their method, we're basically trying to. Okay, everybody, that was 10 minutes. So we're going to go ahead and discuss how people feel about the intro. Let's start with you guys, since you guys didn't weigh in on the abstract part of things.
So we felt it was a bit wordy, the introduction, and we did like the presence of the null hypothesis statement and the end of the introduction describing actually what they did. But I thought we could have condensed it and made it pithier and much more to the point.
So, oh, good. You got too much.
All right. So one of the things that we talked about was this is where it's important to know your audience. And I don't know what journal this was submitted to, but I presume it was some medical journal of some point. And for example, if you were submitted to an ultrasound journal or maybe an emergency medicine journal, like what they care about hearing is probably slightly different and your tone and stuff. But even if this was submitted to like even a general like internal medicine journal, like sentences like the femoral vein is typically located medial to the femoral artery and the inguinal crease is like doesn't need to be stated and is probably a waste, going back to kind of what you were saying about kind of being a little wordy. And then it also, we felt it lost its track a little bit, started meandering and then kind of lost its track as far as like, are we measuring ultrasound? If ultrasound's already the best, why are we measuring? Like, I don't get the why of why this study was needed. There's already outcome studies done that show that ultrasound's better, and you already say that ultrasound's going to be the gold standard, so why do we need to go back and do this? It's not kind of explicitly stated, and that's really what I want to hear more so than like where the femoral vein is located.
So I have one more thing. One of our participants had in Problem Gap Hook, which is an excellent paper by Lorelei Lingard in Perspective of Medical Education. If you haven't read it, it's worth downloading. But that made me think about one thing that also meant to do as a reviewer or as an editor, instead of spending 5 paragraphs taking up all this thing talking about, is I may give someone a reference to an article, whether it's Equator Network, whether it's Lorelei Lingard's Problem Gap Hook framework, to help them dive into this further rather than me taking up the entire page with something. So I'll try to give them a useful reference that they can then use to frame it, which then helps them learn and grow as well.
pretty good.
What I was curious about was whether what did accuracy mean? In other words, what percentage were within 1 centimeter? And I know that's not necessarily for the introduction, but I wanted to just put it in people's minds.
And I was just going to say, this brings up like an important point in peer review and writing is that, you know, everybody has a little bit of a different opinion about how they write it, what they want, what they think is good, what they think is terrible. That's okay. You should be honest. You should say the things that you think. It's been said before. I think it's said more times that remember, if you write your comments as if you were would be comfortable receiving them. Don't be a jerk. Everybody's had like this like scathing, horrible comments. It's like you're a horrible person. This is a dumb idea. Go away. Don't ever write that because again, from my own perspective, right? I've written stuff that's like so stupid and in hindsight, it's like I can't believe how embarrassing that I said that. But like, just be nice. Everybody. It never feels good to have your stuff trash. Now that doesn't mean you can't be honest and report like actual problems, but like do it in a way that's like friendly and that it wouldn't like make you want to crawl into a hole and die if you received it yourself.
Yeah, that's the don't be reviewer too that we sort of talk about. And I think the one thing you want to think about is this, and like when we do resident journal club, my residents are like, no paper ever survives journal club. You know, we're asking you, where's the bias and where's the problem? But in your reviews, it is okay to say what's good, and not every section or every word needs a comment. The longer review is not necessarily better, doesn't necessarily focus the authors on what needs to be done to make it better, right? So it's perfectly fine to say, I get what they're doing, and not have a comment on each section if you don't think that's the key issue. And in fact, if you're reading a paper that you think has a lot of problems, give them a few things that you can fix and let the editor know and move on, because it's wearing and jarring for an author, and it's not helpful at some point, you know, and it's not your job to rewrite their paper or rewrite their design. Okay, so we're going to talk about methods, and I'll be brief because I think this is sort of, not because I don't think it's important, it's the meat of the paper, and it's the one part that sort of, if you can't get past, if there's a fatal flaw in how they design their study, that the paper is going to have trouble getting published. But because I want us to have time to talk about this at the table. So when I read a paper and when I do my reviews, I think of it as sort of the journalism approach, the who, what, how, where, when, how. So I know what they did, how they did it, and my job is to try and make sure they've conveyed that information, because then anyone can look at it and think, that's not how my shop works. This may not be applicable to XYZ patients because they didn't include it, but you have an idea where the flaws may be. And so you want to make sure that you have that content. It also helps to understand, could I replicate this? Or what would I need to do to replicate this? If they identified patients by ICD-9 code, I want to know what those ICD-9 codes are, because then the next thing is when I do my study, I can actually replicate it. And then we've already talked about adherence to reporting guidelines. And so there's the Equator Network, and then there's some other really great papers that have come out over time in different journals about survey design, chart review methods, decision instrument methods that you can look at. Obviously, your main job is to identify bias. And as we just also said, it's to identify the strengths of the study. This is a really hard study to do. It's really difficult to find these patients, to enroll these patients, to capture these patients, to follow them for a year and they didn't lose any patients. Like that's, for those of you, who are involved in research, it's, much harder to do that. So you want to think about that. But your job is to identify, one, if you think there's a fatal flaw. They've asked a question and have not measured the outcome in a reliable or accurate method, that's probably not going to move forward. And what you really want to do is then identify the correctable flaws, or things that at least make it more clear. And sometimes there are correctable flaws, how data is handled, how it was coded, and it was all captured, but how it was analyzed is something that needs to change. Your job is not to be a MESSTATS editor. So I think a lot of people get fearful of reviewing papers because they're like, this is a complex method, I don't understand what they did. And so as a peer reviewer, we know that you may not know all of that, and that is perfectly fine. You are there as the content expert. So if you're like, I don't understand what a hierarchical model is and why they use this regression method, a disclosure to the editor. I think a MESSTATS person needs to look at this part of it. I don't feel comfortable with that. However, as a content expert, you should know what should be accounted for in the model. I think you're going to know better than me sometimes what are the factors that are like most important in predicting this outcome that I might not think about, and did the authors consider it? So that's how I would think about this part of it. Study design, selection of participants, which we'll talk about I think in this paper in terms of those things. And when I hear convenience sampling, I'm like, whose convenience? And so for those of you who do research, it is impossible, not impossible, but it is very difficult to enroll patients 24/7. It's very expensive. Most people don't have research coordinators there all night, or PIs that are available on call all night. And for a lot of things, it does not matter. I mean, most people, if you have a paronychia and I treat you at 10 in the morning versus 10 at night, probably doesn't matter. But if I'm looking at people's social needs and who has access to care, who shows up overnight is a different group. And so that convenience sampling does matter. So is it blocks of time? And then also convenience sampling is important for, did you consecutively approach patients whenever there was a coordinator there, or did you selectively say, this person looks nice and I think they'll answer my survey and I'll ask them, but I won't ask the other person. And so think about how that might enter bias. Data collection, obviously important. And so is it an EHR pool? Is it a chart review? And do they follow standardized methods? And then when it's a survey or a prospective data sheet, sort of how did we ask for those variables? Whenever I see a survey paper, I always ask to see the survey because you want to know how the question was asked. And the outcome measure, obviously the best outcome measure is a patient-centered clinical outcome measure. But at times, a surrogate measure helps get us along the way in a pilot study and what we're sort of doing. So framing that and understanding it is important, and understanding what the authors were trying to convey. And then the statistical plan, as I said, if it's something you don't know, that's perfectly fine. And sort of just understanding it in any way in terms of those things that you're just like, I can't comment on this. And then the editor knows to make sure we have an expert who looks at that, because that's what the author deserves. All right, we'll take some time to go through the methods.
This is really. I know this is kind of a long range, so, yeah.
And that's from.
But what I will say, after that, but I am not sure for lacking to talk about how it was prepared after we and then what was good information, hopefully they touching sample selection will talk about so we can assume that
That's what they
So, you know, to identify let's make it information as a This goes along with that this checklist that you just talked about earlier. So this is gonna be on this robust line. Framework that will use to determine which and knowing high utilities. It's just like right, that as a reviewer, like, the content is great, but, you know, the delivery of it, you use a little because behind it, more legit. Or more digestible for the reader, and there. Think of yourself as you're like a pioneer of this paper. So they want to know they'll look what you do if they want to be aware of what you're doing. And so it makes you feel like take it together. Not Potentially something difficult, not if Yeah, no, these are all great to bring up. In terms of like thinking about just the methodology, with enough information. Is they give me enough information that I can repeat this study, and if the information that's there is reasonable, that they should be able to get the results that I should get. Everything else, detailed stuff, I can go back and tell them afterwards. Consider it a critical flaw, I should be methods, and I'm like, I don't know that I could reproduce this, or I don't know that actually fair stuff feels like a evaluator based on the methodology that you have. But for like my third question approach to my methodology, based on what they wrote, try to reduce it. Even if not, then this is down right there. And I make my partial. So intended to be something, bias for the study, or, they're questionable, those are usually all things that are the method section is one where I find a lot of things that I mentioned in that. Okay, sorry, that was really loud. I hear everybody talking at all their tables. Dr. Cooper's table, do you guys want to talk about what you felt, how you evaluated this methods section?
Yeah, we just had a nice discussion, but I think for better external validity of this study, the data must have been supervised by at least board certified physicians, since the data was mainly collected by medical students, and I don't know how it's reliable, since ultrasound is operator dependent tool. That was my concern.
Yeah, so one of the discussions we had is discussion that I sort of have at most ultrasound papers. So as we said, it's sort of sonographer dependent. And this is a study we're looking at like blind technique versus where do you find things on ultrasound. But most ultrasound studies are often looking at is how well do we do a procedure, how long does it take to learn a procedure, how accurate are we compared to other people, and it very much depends not just on what the patients look like and who you decide to enroll and which data, but it ends up who's actually doing the study. And so this is one of those things when it's clinician behavior you're often looking at and provider behavior. So we'll talk about that's the unit of analysis. So when we're talking about subjects, we want to know about who the sonographers are and who the patients are, how you captured them, and also sort of some individual performance. Because to assume that I'm much older than Brian, and like my residents also like would not ask me to do the ultrasound. I mean, I can do most anything, and I probably am much better at a blind line than any of my residents, but hands down, the med students are better at ultrasound than I am. So in terms of quality of performance and how good is this, but if you want to say whose gestalt is better, like what does this patient have compared to this decision instrument, I think I'd go head to head with most of them. And that's just sort of a time and experience. So thinking about that type of stuff with the unit of analysis. And then the other comment that came up was 7 millimeters, like there was why was this cutoff chosen? Is this clinically important in terms of how far off you would be if you did a poke for a line? Would that mean you have to totally move your needle out and restart and reposition? Or 7 millimeters, like if you could just adjust a little bit, it's within a realm of what's clinically important. And that's a question for all of us to think about with anything. Is this clinically important? And that may be different as your reviewer to different reviewers.
So to that point, because when I trained, I rode my pet dinosaur uphill both ways to and from the hospital, I learned doing blind femoral. And I would have loved to know when you use the finger technique, if ultrasound's the gold standard, does it skew you medially or laterally? And that would be potentially a big ask of the authors, because if in the world I think of navel all the time, so that would be the right groin, if skewed medially is positive numbers and skewed negatively is negative numbers, that would have been two-tailed testing or different data gathering, and the paper looks like it presents an absolute difference. So, because I'm okay with doing lines without ultrasound, that's when I shine, because I don't know what to do with an ultrasound. It hadn't been invented. So that would just be super helpful. So like if the power's out, I can do the finger technique and show up the residents. Other than that, just put me in the corner. One of our other group members asked a great question about the sample size of 52. Is it 52 people, meaning each person has a right and a left groin, or is it 52 groins? We just weren't quite sure of the sample size that resulted.
Statements for the sample size calculation being reviewed. For the 7 millimeters, 17 millimeters, where do they come from? 52 groins, 52 patients, and then the one-tailed assessment for stats is questionable. Whenever I see one tail, I ask why. So they would need to justify that to get to your point about is it medial or lateral, and your point that if it's 1 centimeter lateral, 1 centimeter medial on 2 different patients, and you average them, then spot on. We want that. We need to know if it's lateral or medial. Never would have thought that myself. My colleagues did. So that's why you get 2 or 3 reviews. Somebody's going to notice. Wait a minute. It matters whether it's medial or lateral. And all you have to say as a reviewer is it's the power calculation statement to me is unclear. Please clarify 52, 717, and move on.
Yeah, I had a slightly different take on the 7 millimeters, and it made me, when I saw the 7 millimeters, it made me wonder what percentage were within the 7 millimeters and what percentage were outside of the 7 millimeters, which is a different statistic that you were doing. But that leads into a comment that I have, which is one of the things that scares people the most about being peer reviewers is that you don't understand the statistics. And as somebody who's taught this for way too long, I still find that there's a lot of statistical stuff that I don't get, and I'm trying to figure out whether it's going to be legitimate or not. Most journals, and I'll use Western Journal of Emergency Medicine as an example, have methodology and statistics reviewers who are specifically there to help you with that. And if you don't understand it, nobody's going to fault you for saying, I don't get this. I'd like to have a methodology statistical reviewer look at this paper for this
Correct.
reason."
And one of those reviewers is actually up next to talk about just that.
All right. Yeah, stats is a complicated topic, but it's the best topic. So the results should be like clear, concise, and they should tell a story that like flows naturally. The order of the results presented should generally match the methodology, the way the method section is written, so that, you know, primary outcomes, secondary outcomes, et cetera, you know, sort of like descriptive statistics should kind of come first, basic. There should be a basic flow that makes it easy to read, so you're not jumping back and forth between different sections of the methods and the results to try to understand things. There should be a balance between text and tables. You don't want to have either, you know, a plethora of tables and it's just like data overload, and it's like, what do you really want? What do you really care about? What do you want me as a reader to care about? What's the most salient points? But at the same time, you don't want every single line from a table mentioned in the text. In general, you kind of want the things that you include in the text should be the most important, the most salient, the things you really want readers to take away from the study. And then it's supported by stuff in tables, stuff in figures. Again, you guys can all probably remember having read a paper where it reads through very smoothly and you kind of get what they're saying. You're like, oh, okay, this makes sense. I can see here, and stuff where you're just like all over the place trying to figure out like what's the most important, because there's 15 supplements and 8 tables and 9 figures from a study of, you know, 6 patients. The stats thing, I would just say, one is read about a stats topic every paper you read. I remember when I did, you know, undergraduate EBM, it's like sensitivity and specificity. Like I didn't understand that for like 8 years. Like look up a t-test, look up, you know, parametric, non-parametric test, chi-squared, whatever. Learn a little bit of something every time, because that will make it easier for you to do peer reviews. The next time it'll make your reading of the medical literature stronger. You'll be able to make more informed decisions. And yeah, if something is very complicated, like mixed effects models, random effects models, you don't understand something, just, you know, say that, recommend to the editor that maybe they should get a stats review, put it into the comment. You know, you can also put it into your own comments, say like, I don't really understand the statistics, so I can't comment specifically on, you know, X, Y, or Z. Be polite. In general, like I said, I think you should frame things as like, ask questions as opposed to saying like this was done incorrectly, like, or did you consider like within patient correlation of the femoral veins on each side, as opposed to, you know, treating them as independent measures. The same thing like ultrasound user, there's both between scanner correlation and between patient correlation. So say something like that and be like, hey, you did this all wrong because there's correlation within subjects and within scanners that you didn't take into account, and therefore your confidence intervals is wrong. And what you're really saying is like, I know a lot more than you do, so let me point out how smart I am and how dumb you are. And you shouldn't do that, because you will be on the receiving end of that. Sometimes I think I'm pretty smart and I do a lot of statistics, and I made a stupid mistake in a paper I submitted like a month ago, and, you know, someone called me out on it. And anyways, yeah, that's it. Yay, stats.
All right, we're starting to run just a little bit behind. This is a shorter section, so I'm going to give every table 5 minutes, and then we'll talk about it real quick and then move on to the next section. And then this way, as they address those things, you can just remove it. Yeah, right. And so that would be a great suggestion because they should have that data.
And then researchers, they mentioned the number of researchers that and like trade reviews, some of the sectors. But then go to SAEM release. So obviously, there's 5 people that are in grades 39, and then there's 39 grades.
Although, so they do evaluate that, it's not just the amount that. So that should have it. So this is where it's like, Taylor makes a lot of bias. And it shows. So that would come factored in. They're not true.
So I need to understand that. Sure. Being an E graded in processors. There's processors in there.
Do you think it reflects their methodology, like what they said they're going to offer? Is there anything that I don't talk about the range of what I want to do? This is a big one, because sometimes people will talk about, oh, what the data on this, and it's not actually anywhere in the So there's something analysis is in this study. So it counts if the international. We did a subject analysis here. Table. So she put all that in. They don't mention it. They would spell out. So you don't have to on the line.
All right, guys, to keep things moving along, we're going to quickly discuss what everybody thought about the results.
So at our table, one of the things that was discussed is there was no reporting on how many measurements were made with somebody's left hand versus somebody's right hand. You know, are we doing the measurements always same-handed for same-sided amongst the researchers, right? Because that could potentially have made a difference. And then we were talking about the number of large-handed researchers versus small-handed researchers and how many evaluations they made and how that may have affected the data that we see reported here.
Do you prefer the term hand-sized challenge?
The hand-sized challenged researchers. All right, anybody else at another table with a quick comment on results that they want to weigh in on before we move to the next thing? Why did they pick 25? BMI? Yeah, right. That it would have been useful if that would have been explained somewhere why they decided a cutoff of 25. Was it arbitrary? What factored into that? Right, because that affects the results that we end up seeing.
And also you did make mention of laterality versus medial. That could have been a very important variable to quantify, explain, and report.
They may have used the 25 body mass index because that's a national definition between not obese and mildly obese, whatever it is. But they should say that.
Then you like we had a flow figure, right? So we all people, there were 500 people, 25 were below BMI 25. That tell me about my. And if it's difficult to find, is someone they didn't talk or anything else, it's difficult to find, and I'm going to do that. So when I did this ultrasound study, and so it says I know Apple shape, and I don't tell you about all the things that in the window. I'll just skip that person. Skip that person. I only give you the technical and that's finger. That's a little bit different. So, but how much does this apply? It doesn't make it wrong or right. If it's done well, it's done well for each patient. So the justification of why, and I don't get how that fits in the flow.
Yeah.
It's like an ultrasound intention.
Yeah, so the other thing we talked about here was precision. They report a precision of like 0.1/100th of a millimeter. I can't imagine measuring 1/100th of a millimeter as an actual precision. And then p-values out to 0.0001 with 87 patients. That seems a little bit off. And then the flow sheet is missing too, like from a convenience sample, like how many people did they approach and how, like also like the people they didn't approach, was there some bias there? Like did they have a different BMI than the people they did or whatnot? But I want to move on here to the actual most important section, despite what all of the other previous people had said, the discussion, limitations, and conclusion we're going to talk about. So the discussion here is really the way to frame the paper and kind of go back and explain its importance. So you explain the gap kind of in the introduction and why we need it. Now you get to say kind of how it fits into clinical practice and how it fits into kind of other studies that have been done. It's important in the discussion not to just rehash the results. Like the results have already been stated. You don't need to take up words and space to rehash them. If anything, one sentence to repeat the kind of major findings. But really what you want to do is take this and say, why is this important? Like what should we do with this? So when we saw the abstract conclusion when they were talking about using point of care ultrasound for femoral access, this is where you could hypothesize that might be something that could be done. And how does this fit in with other studies, right? So how does this fit in with all of the other studies that we know about where anatomic landmarks are and how accurate they are and how accurate we are with kind of ultrasound guided access? And then also what are the strengths of the study and what kind of is the novelty to kind of reiterate this and how this differs from those other studies that have been done. As part of the discussion, depending on the journal, there's different sections for limitations and or future research. Some of them have it all together in the discussion. Some of them have different sections. But there does need to be a limitation section. Every study has limitations as we've identified here. Some of the common ones to look at are the methods appropriate to identify what you were looking for. So for example, in this one, they didn't look at patient outcomes, and we probably care about patient outcomes. Is it generalizable, right? So if we only included people with a BMI less than 35, I don't know where you practice. I practice in Wichita. We have more than 50% of our population, I believe, has a BMI greater than 35. So that's not necessarily generalizable to the patients that I see. And then any biases that could be there, again, going back to that flow diagram that we talk about, you could have unintended biases just by choosing different people. You could say, you know, these people look nice, or those kind of type things. So I'm going to go to the people who look nice, which in this study may or may not matter, but in the social determinant study like may have some implications. And then you also want to look at future research. So if this was done and there was future research on outcomes that could be done about it, that would be something you can hypothesize. In this study in particular, I think all of that outcome research has kind of already been done. Can we go one more slide? Also the conclusions. So the key thing for the conclusions, going back to what Dr. Langdorf said about the conclusions in the kind of abstract portion here, the conclusions really need to be evidenced from this study and the data that they presented to you. So the conclusions of in the abstract that we talked about like POCUS should be used for central femoral access is not really what's demonstrated here. We know that ultrasound is more accurate, but then going back to what we talked about, like they kind of already implied that before they did the study that ultrasound was going to be more accurate. So it's not really a super valid conclusion, other than maybe the anatomic method has high inaccuracy. So it shouldn't be an opinion of what to do with it, and also the conclusion shouldn't be based off of other papers and other literature that's been done. You can use that to formulate your conclusion, but you really shouldn't be taking data from other papers and using it to make your own kind of conclusion. So we'll take about 5 minutes to do this. I know that that's a lot, but we are running short on time. So we can peruse the discussion and conclusion section, and then we'll get back together.
Okay. Thank you guys. This was fun. Can we stay in touch somehow? Yes, we can. I want to have training someday to do a root script. Yes. Why don't you start it a little taller? I did that in Richmond. They document see that when my health did. Thank you. Very proud of being in those 10th grade. And they just call me Oh. All right. Yeah, we're kind of pressed on time, folks. So we're going to stop right here. I'm afraid I apologize. Apparently, there was a mistake made on the printing, and we didn't get the limitations. That's what that blank page is supposed to be. Sorry about that. Yeah, it was. I should have looked at it closer when I picked it up at the printer, obviously. So I sort of wanted to close out by giving a few minutes. Anybody have any comments that they want to make on the discussion, whatever the part that we were able to read? Let's start with that.
I just wanted to mention on limitations, I think very important section that when if you are publishing something and clearly like this manuscript had like tons of limitations, but probably not a lot listed. But when I think reviewers respect that because we're trying to report the truth. And research is difficult and there's so many factors and we're trying to minimize confounders, but there's only so much that we can do. But so if you really just exhaust yourself and think of every possible confounder and limit, which is a limitation, that a reviewer will respect your efforts and you actually kind of get reviewer points for that, if you will.
Yeah, I would say sort of the best limitations to say this is why it's a limitation and what the potential magnitude and direction of that benefit is. This tends to, I will underestimate what is true based on this, or I may overestimate. And so that it puts some of it in context, not just, it was a retrospective review, so it's going to have some bias. Like, not necessarily. What does it mean? Yes. And then we considered a sensitivity analysis, or we did this, or this is why we chose that, understanding that limitation. Yeah.
And I think that's the key. I get a lot of papers where I read the limitation and says, well, one limitation is because this was only done in a Dutch population. And I'm saying, well, why is that a limitation? I mean, is there something about Dutch people that is different than other people? How would that affect the results? So when you're reviewing a paper, hold the authors accountable for describing what's going to happen. Pretty much just emphasizing what Rochelle and Lynn just said. All right, we're kind of running out of time, and apparently this room is being used. So let me throw the floor open to questions. Nobody has any questions? Oh, yes. We should be paid lots and lots of money. But don't hold your breath because that's not going to happen. My own personal feeling is that in order for science to move forward, in order for science to be honest and transparent and replicable, we need good peer reviewers. And this is something that we do as part of our debt to society. But from what, going on back to what Brian said earlier, is that the ACGME is now seeing that this is something that is important and is going to be made accountable in the residency training. And so that at least people who are training residents will get some compensation because they'll be responsible for evaluating residents' peer reviews.
Close enough. One of the other things every one of you can do to advocate is at your institutional P&T boards, how is it valued there? That costs nothing to anybody, but if your P&T committee says peer review matters, then that helps you go from assistant to associate to full professor.
In my institution, I have to submit, not just do I review for journal, how many reviews did you do since your last review? Because we have steps. So every 3 years, I have to say how many reviews I did. Like I have to track, quantify that. So there is service and value. I think most of us, we do it because it makes it a little better. But I just want to say, really appreciate you coming. We're all really passionate about it, but just sort of like the amount of discussion and
Dan, I would advocate, I would do this for free. So tell
Yeah.
the board, free workshop, right? Who wants to-
Yes, please do. Give them feedback from this that that this should be a free work.
Yeah. So I don't know. Maybe it's me, but reject always sounds so, I don't know, complete and obvious and mean. It's like, because any paper, if you go back and hit the drawing board, you could fix it and it might be resurrected. So like, what is just a reject? Like they give you like no results or.
As a decision editor, I kind of look at how much work has to go into making it better. If it's a little bit of work here and there, then it's revised. You know, I won't necessarily say accept with revisions until it's almost complete. But if it's something that needs a huge amount of work and that has clearly some big pieces that are missing, then I would say reject. Feel free to resubmit with the revisions that we suggest.
And on the slide is a category that here. On the slide is a category that we use, which is revise and resubmit. So it needs a whole rewrite, but it's got merit. And I use the word decline, not reject, because decline is softer and it's really what we mean. Because there's 125 journals in the world that have emergency medicine somewhere in the title. And it can find a place someplace. It may not be with your journal. So revise and resubmit, or major revision required. Just say what you think. And it doesn't mean it's never going to get published. It just means the limitation section is going to be as long as the paper, which is okay. And I think I have certainly done that. So you get a journal that's very discriminating, and they will make you add many, many things to the limitation section, and that's all right. So decline, and then just say revise and resubmit.
All right, guys, they need to use this room.
Now, as a final comment, Addie, I'm going to take over here for a
Well,
second.
I was going to say, why don't we just step out into the hallway, and if there's people with more
Well-
questions for the editors, they can ask them out there.
We'll do that. But I'm offering my services as a mentor for anyone here in this group who wants help with a peer review that they're working on or that they would like to undertake. And I'm hoping that some of my co-presenters will agree to do that too. So, all right.
Thanks to Dan for putting this all together.
Yay, Dan. Yeah.
And thanks to all of you for being here. Thank you.